back to Retro Depot. Today we're going to be taking a short video on repairing motherboards. I've got a total of about 7 motherboards out here. They're all AT style motherboards. And we're going to be talking about some of the things to focus on. Considerations on whether or not to repair a motherboard, as well as some of the techniques that I use in order to repair a motherboard. Now, full disclosure, I am not an engineer, I'm a hobbyist. So everything that I do here, or will show you what I've done rather, this is coming from personal experience. If you follow any of these guidelines and you end up ruining your own board due to not being able to reproduce the results, or just simply following my instructions, I take no responsibility for that. I am by no means an expert, but I have been dabbling in electronics for about 10 years now, and I've got a pretty good understanding, so bear that in mind. Not everybody is going to have the level of knowledge that I have, and some others may have a more advanced skill and do things very differently than me. So keep that in mind, but we're going to jump right into it because I had several people ask me to do a video on this after the last video, the ATX computer case conversion video. So I'm going to show you some boards from Computer Reset, of all places, the holy grail of the vintage computing club at the moment. So we're going to jump right into it. This right here is a 386 board. It's a Biotech and chipsets. It's a pretty standard run-of-the-mill 386 DX40. It does have a place here for a math coprocessor. It's got 8 of the 30-pin SIM slots, as well as a spot for up to 256K of cache. So for a 386, this is actually a pretty nice little board here. But it's got some problems, and most of the problems are pretty small, insignificant, can be repaired. Some of them maybe not. So first thing I want to talk to you about is right here at the bottom of the board, or top of the board, depending upon how you like to orient these. EEPROM. Notice something? It's not covered up. What does that tell us? Well, it tells us that this thing may not work, and unless we can actually find a BIOS for this, we may not be able to get it working. That's a pretty big problem right there. You can't just go online and download the BIOS for any given motherboard, especially from this era, because a lot of them haven't been saved. And unless you can find, for example, on Vogons or somewhere like that, where somebody has got this particular motherboard and has uploaded the BIOS for it, you may be in a situation where even if you repaired this, it may be completely useless to you. So, having said that, yeah, you need to keep that in mind. That should be one of the first things that you look at, is the RAM chip, or the ROM chip rather, is it covered? If it's not covered, first thing you want to do is break out a programmer and dump that code. You need to see if there's anything on there and preserve what's on there now, because lighting, even if it is artificial, it can erase EEPROMs. So keep that in mind. Not to mention, this board is probably close to 30 years old now. Looks like most of the chips on here are marked 1992 and 1993. So yeah, it's 28 years old. I think the guaranteed life expectancy of an EEPROM is something like 10 years. Even with it covered, there may already be bit rot. So that's something that you need to take into consideration. Now, another problem that you have with these motherboards, and you'll see it on this one, corrosion. Yep. See, right here they have that hideous Varta battery, and those were nickel cadmium, or cadmium, however you say it. They were rechargeable. They leak all over the place. This one is fortunate. The keyboard connector is completely replaceable. Well, I don't have one here. I thought I did. But you can replace this. Standard DIN 5 keyboard connector. It's not a problem. But if you get a whole lot of corrosion up in this area here, it can do several things. It can erode traces to your keyboard controller. And that's probably one of the most common problems. The second one is obviously power traces, because typically you have your power connector here, and it's usually in close proximity to that battery, and a lot of times you end up getting power traces that are completely eaten away. Another issue is obviously RAM. It can eat away the signals for the memory, the memory expansion, the SIMs. And then even sometimes you can get it down into the ISA bus, and you'll have to go through and patch connections. So those are all things that you need to take into consideration considering these types of boards. This one here, it's in really good shape. There's not much wrong with this board. Really, it needs a cleaning and the keyboard connector replaced, and that's really the only thing I can see as far as damage. But that EEPROM, it may work, it may not. It's hard to say. So you need to take that into consideration. Now, the next board we have here, this is also a really nice board. This is another, I want to say, a 486 or a 386 board. If I'm not mistaken, this socket here is designed for either a 486 or a 386. And it also has a spot here for the coprocessor. Yeah, it's actually a really, really nice board. It's a UMC chipset. It looks like it again has spots for up to 256K of cache. Now this one's interesting because this one also has the, I believe it's called micro-channel architecture, a slot built on. I've personally never used that, so I'm sorry, I don't know what it's about. I was still a little bit young whenever that stuff came around. We may have had one on one of the first PCs that we had, but that was before I was ever pulling the case open and digging inside. I wasn't really doing that until the end of the 486 era, beginning of the Pentium era. I really didn't start doing it a lot until the Pentium 2 era. So by that time it was all PCI, maybe a couple ISA slots, some, AGP slots, stuff like that. But anyhow, this is another nice board, but this one's got a lot of damage. And to be frank with you, even though this is a really nice board, this one may be more work than what it's worth. And what I mean by that is the battery corrosion battery corrosion on the board. Now, the keyboard connector doesn't look as bad, but man, this thing is grody. So I'm going to get a pin here, and I'm going to point some things out. Actually, I'll grab a screwdriver. It's a little bit better. So you can see all of the corrosion in this area right here. And if you look just right, you can see there's black places where there used to be traces. That's the glue under the copper. The glue that they used on these, when the copper gets eaten away, it shows black. So that's a pretty good way of determining whether or not there's a broken trace or not. And as you can tell, there's corrosion down next to these ICs here. Some of the traces in between and possibly underneath are completely gone. The battery powering circuit here for recharging the battery is mostly gone. I can guarantee you that you're going to have some problems with the power connector here. It looks like there's at least 2, maybe 3 traces from the memory slots that are gone. And this is also a hybrid board. So let me see if I can show you this right here. Maybe you can see that or not. But there are actually SMD resistors and SMD resistors on this board. So this was this is a pretty advanced board for its time. The 386 BIOS on here is from 1986, so I know that doesn't really tell you a whole lot, but it looks like the chipsets are all from around 1992. So this was probably made around 1992 or 1993, so they had already started transitioning over to SMD resistors at this point. which is actually pretty remarkable. I wouldn't have expected them to have done that soon. But, like I said, as nice of a board as this is, as you can see, the backside is pretty clean. There's not a whole lot wrong with it. But something like this, I take one look at this, and the first thing that comes to my mind is, if I can repair this, it's going to be a job. You know, you can even see on the back, that is where a trace used to be. It used to run down here along that line. It's not even there anymore. And there's a couple other spots on this board that are like that. So 2 out of 2, maybe one of them can be repaired. Now this board here, on the other hand, this is a Pitium board. It's a AT board. It's got 4 72-pin sockets. It's got 4 ISA slots, and I'm not quite sure what that is again. I think it's microchannel. I don't really know. Like I said, never did mess with that. As well as a couple ISA slots. Now this board here, it was really a smart decision with this board. This board does not appear to have a backup battery on board, which is crazy as that seems. I've looked and it doesn't have one. It doesn't even have a spot for one that I can tell. What I'm thinking on this board is that there was a power connector that they were possibly using somewhere, but I can't find it. But what they do have is a Dallas real-time clock module with the battery inside. Now, I haven't booted this board up. I don't know if this board is alive or dead still. These batteries, they go out, and the only way you're going to fix that is one of 2 ways. First off, either crack this thing open, solder a new battery in, or you can actually desolder this real-time clock and find a new one, probably remanufactured in China, and stick it in there. Now, I don't have any experience with those, so I can't speak for them. They may be okay, they may not be, but at the end of the day, it's kind of a shot in the dark. I doubt you're going to find any real-time clocks here in the United States, at least the Dallas DS12B 887s that are still alive. I can almost guarantee you all of those things are dead at this point. So if you're going to find some, it's probably going to be from China. It's going to be something that they've remanufactured, which for the most part, I've bought chipsets from China. They seem to work fine. That is an option for you though. However, the big problem with this board is actually a huge problem. And like I said, I haven't fired this thing up. I don't know if it even boots, but I can tell you that if it does, it's not going to do a whole lot. You might ask me why, because it looks to be in great shape. Well, this board looks to be in great shape, but it needs some major repairs. And part of that is because of how these things are stored at Computer Reset. Take a board, throw it over in a corner, stack some stuff up on top of it. If you haven't seen pictures of that place before the volunteers have got it cleaned up, it's something else. That place was just stacked to the rafters with computers stacked on top of stuff. Even the front room, it looks like a hoarder's paradise. It really does. And thankfully, you know, that's kind of what the guy was. You know, he held on to a lot of stuff that a lot of people probably would have thrown away. And my understanding is that he kind of recycled a little bit of it at a time. But yeah, he kind of repaired stuff, and he, you know, sold parts to repair stuff, and otherwise just hoarded stuff. And yeah, if it weren't for him doing that, we would not be in the very good position we're in today of finding such a treasure trove of vintage equipment. Now, enough ranting about that. Let's talk about this board. So I'm going to show you the board real quick. Can you see what's wrong with it? Kind of hard to see. Maybe right in this area here. So several things. Try to get this so that you can see. Right there, those are broken traces. Something has scratched this board. There's another one right here, and there is a third one down here. I'm not sure if that's showing up on camera or not. But something has scratched the backside of this board and completely cut those traces. And I forget exactly how many are broken, but some of them are broken in multiple places. And they absolutely will require a repair. We'll have to connect those up in order to get this board going. Now, to further complicate things, where these traces run to are these little vias towards the top of the board here. And if you flip them over and take a look, they run to the chipsets. So that's all SMD work, and that is going to be hard for most people to do. Now, there are techniques of doing that, and I'm going to go over them here in a few minutes, but the short story is this. If you find a board that is damaged like this, and you don't have enough soldering experience to be able to repair those, let me give you some advice. That board is beyond your capability of repairing. You better have a good friend that knows how to do it, or you better plan on finding this board a good home for cheap. And when I say for cheap, I don't care how much you paid for the board. If it's damaged like this, the person that repairs it is probably going to have 8 to 12 hours into this board, diagnosing it and testing it, and even then still he may not be able to get this board going. There may be something else wrong with this board. You have to remember, this board was pulled out of something, and it may have been pulled out of something for a reason. So if he can't get it repaired, not only is he out his money and his time, but he's also now got a board he can't do anything with. So if it's beyond your repair, you need to cut your losses, get it to somebody that can actually repair it, potentially save this board. It's not just about the computing. This is about preservation, and I cannot stress that enough. There's a finite amount of this equipment out there in the world, and there's a whole lot of people that have this equipment that don't know how to care for it. So that said, if you don't know how, get it to somebody that does. Okay? Now, certainly there are some people that would repair it for you for a fee. Whether or not you can afford that's another story, and of course how reputable they are is another story altogether. But something like this, for the advanced guy, the guy that's got, quite a bit of soldering skills, it's not that big of a job. It is going to take some time to repair and diagnose and make sure the whole thing is working, but it's definitely not for the amateur. But that is something that you may end up having to do. So now that we've gotten these three out of the way, I want to take a look at some boards that have been repaired. So this one here is a 486DX board. Again, it's got 30 pin SIMs, 256K of cache is available. It's also got a swappable clock module on here for any frequency clock that you choose to go with, so long as your processor supports it. It's got 7 ISA slots, only 2 are 8-bit only, and of course 8 30-pin SIMs. This one was actually not in bad shape. So the first thing to take note of with the batteries, they're almost always going to eat up the keyboard traces. Specifically, it's the traces for the clock and the signal, okay? Because those are kind of bidirectional. But yeah, they, for some reason, almost always eat those up. And I think it has to do with those traces being very thin, as well as their proximity to where the battery connector is. They're just like the first thing to go. Now, what I like to do is actually use wire wrap wire. And you might be able to see this. I'll connect to, in this particular case, this here is a NOT gate. And I'll run these wires all the way back to where they need to go and solder them on. Now, once that's done and I've tested the board and confirmed that it boots and it works correctly, the next thing you want to do is go over it with some type of sealant. And while I say sealant, it doesn't have to be anything special. What I use is actually clear fingernail polish. I use a rapid dry version, And essentially it does a couple things. First off, it tacks this down so that you can't pull on this. It's not going to pull away. You're not going to accidentally snag it on something and tear that trace back off. What it's going to do is it's going to hold it firmly to the board. And the second thing that it's going to do is it's going to prevent further corrosion. So if you look up here by the keyboard connector, you might be able to see I've added some in right there. And the reason for that being is because there was a copper trace there. And I forget exactly what it goes to, but it was exposed. And the thing about motherboards, and this is what a lot of people don't understand, the pads may be coated in solder. Okay, the solder is not, it may corrode a little bit, but it's not going to get down and eat away the copper itself in most cases. But once the silk screen, in this case the green coating on top, comes off, it's bare copper beneath that. And unfortunately, oxidation takes place. It's just the air, okay? It's going to eat away at it. It doesn't have to be a corrosive battery, so you need to protect that somehow. But once I did that, this board worked great. Boots right up. I didn't really have any problems with it. Of course, you know, as I mentioned before, always check that EEPROM. This one seems to be working great. No problems with it whatsoever. Of course, we've got the external battery connector here, so we don't need to worry about that. We can always hook up an external source, but something like this, pretty simple fix. 1, 2, 3, 4 wires that I had to replace, and it took me probably 3 hours to diagnose this board completely. And whenever I say diagnose, I'm literally going through with a multimeter and beeping out each trace just to make sure that everything connects to where it's supposed to go. And once you get that done, a board like this actually makes for a pretty decent little computer. Now, the next one that I have here, this one, it's another board that had quite a bit of corrosion in this area here. It's actually discolored in places. Now, the good news about this board is that this board actually booted first time go, but the keyboard wouldn't work. And again, turns out it was the keyboard traces. I had to put another wire in here, right here, to repair that. Once I did, though, this board works well. Again, it's a 486. It's got a kind of a unique socket here. But yeah, it's a great little board, and this one is pretty simple to repair. One thing I like about this board is it actually has the places for the 72 pin sockets there. They're already wired up. You just have to connect them up, and you know, you should be able to put either 72 pin or 30 pin RAM in this. This one also has 256K of cache already installed, and this is also a Win BIOS, so that's a pretty unique type of BIOS. I always thought it was kind of sexy back in the day, but that's another good example of a simple repair done on these keyboards. These are the common problems that you're going to see whenever you're doing these repairs. It's going to be almost the same problem on most of the boards. It's the keyboard traces, battery traces, sometimes power. Speaking of power, this is one that actually had the power rails repaired. Now this one is a SIS board, it's a SIS 486. Really a nice board. Again, it's got 30 pin or 72 pin RAM. Yeah, it's got places for up to 256K of cache memory, as well as a VESA local bus. So really a nice board. But again, that damn battery, you can tell I had to put quite a bit of coating on this just to be able to save these traces. And what I was talking about before, you can see, if I can get the glare off there, you can see there's a black trace right here. That trace is, well, that black little line is where the trace used to be. It's not there anymore. But this one was a chore. This one took quite a bit of time in order to get it going. And if I show you the back, you can see there's a few repairs here. So if we zoom in, first we can see that there's a repair line coming down here and going up. These black wires here, that's actually the power. And then we also have a couple other little jump wires here in the wire wrap wire in order to connect back up those, again, keyboard connectors, or keyboard signals. Without those going to the keyboard controller, you might be able to get it to boot, but you can't do anything with it. So again, that's what you'll have to do. And if you haven't noticed on most of these boards, I'll just grab these two because I've already put that one back up. I've actually replaced the keyboard connector on both of these. Now these are just cheap Chinese DIN 5 connectors, but they work, they do the job, and they're plastic, so you're going to have less of a problem with any type of corrosion going further into it. But yeah, those are the types of things to do. Now with these, a lot of these things you can just, like I mentioned before, you can connect up to a solder joint that's already on the board that you know goes to that. You have to manually trace those out and figure out where they go and connect it up to where it's supposed to go, somewhere between the break. That's pretty easy to do, but let me see if I can find one here, because I know for a fact that I have one. Right here. So, like I mentioned before, on the other ones it's SMD and through hole. I mentioned that I was going to show you how you can repair those. Again, you have to have a steady hand, but you have to find a via, and I'll try to get it so that you can see it. That right there is a via, and you have to kind of gently remove the solder mask from over the top of it, stick the wire down in there with a little bit of solder paste, and basically get a good hot iron and solder it down into that via. That's one way of doing the repair. It's not the prettiest way of doing it, but you'll get a functional signal, and that's really what matters. But again, that's another problem that you end up running into with these boards really just about all the time, to be frank with you. You're going to end up having signals that you're not going to be able to connect via a pad. And if you don't have a pad, your only other option is to go for the next best thing, which is a via. And especially if it's surface mount, you might be able to connect it to one of the legs on the chip itself, but that's always kind of risky, because if you leave it on there too long, sometimes those pads on the leg tend to lift off the board. And if that happens, that board's gonna need some real work done. You're gonna have to figure out a way to glue that pad back down. But yeah, that's what you're gonna run into quite a bit. Now, the next board that I'm going to show you here is actually a board that runs. Now, this board had a very minor repair, but the repair that I did kept this board from working. Now, this is a run-of-the-mill standard 386 SX. It's really a nice board. I actually got this board pretty cheap. I want to say it was like 20 bucks with free shipping on eBay. It was sold as non-working as is, but it looked to be in such good shape I couldn't pass it up. I knew that I should be able to get this board working. I just needed to put some time in on it. And believe it or not, this board had me confused for probably a year and a half. I kid you not, I dicked with this board for a year and a half, and I never could get it running. Until finally I just sat down and I worked out what it had to be. So this board, you would turn it on and it would show signs of life. It would beep at you, it would throw memory codes, and you know, it wouldn't generate any video, so you didn't know what was going on as far as, you know, booting through the BIOS. But with a you know, a boot card. So finally what I did with this is I went over every single trace on this board. I couldn't find a single one of them that was broken. Nothing appeared to be out of the ordinary at all. Everything appeared to be perfect on this board. It's got zero corrosion. Whenever I say that, it's got a very light amount around here, but all that checked out. There were not any problems with that. So I broke out the boot card one day and I just plugged it in with nothing but that and I think a megabyte of memory here, you know, some 256K RAM sticks. And I just started looking up the BIOS codes. BIOS code that it kept on throwing was a memory issue, as well as a problem with, I want to say it was the CMOS RAM, which I expected because there's no battery on this, okay? So we're expecting this to have a CMOS error of some kind. Well, the memory, I finally got the brought it. Well, let's just pull the memory out and let's see if the memory works with something else. So I pulled it out, stuck it into a different motherboard, and you know what? The memory was dead. And what it was a single RAM stick that was just not working. So I decided at that point, okay, well, I've got some more 256K sticks, so let me just, mix and match these and get it back to where it's going. So I did that, fired up the machine, and guess what? Now it doesn't throw me the memory errors, but it's still throwing me the CMOS errors, and it's not booting up the video card. Well, that's weird, because even if the CMOS battery was dead, it should be, giving me some type of video signal, because it's just going to tell me that I need to go back into my CMOS settings and set those. But it wasn't doing that, and I couldn't figure out why. And of course, at that point, I'm stumped again. What could this be? Well, I got to looking at the board, and I noticed that it had the HM6818P, which is actually a clone of another real-time clock module. I'll put the name down in the description. I can't remember it off the top of my head. So I got online and I found a place over in China, and I ordered 5 or 10 of them or something along those lines, and thought to myself, you know what, I can get a couple of these, and at the end of the day, if they fix the problem, fantastic. I've got, a working board and a couple extra real-time clocks in case I need them. And if it doesn't work, I've got a couple extra real-time clocks if I need them. And I've got a board that's still partially alive and partially dead that I can continue to try to repair. Well, as I am in the process of waiting on these things to come in, I've got an idea. I know that this is a problem with the real-time clock. And do you know what's right next to the real-time clock? An octal transceiver. Do you know what that does? It gates when the data bus is going to be speaking to a particular peripheral. So I break out the oscilloscope, and I wire up my testy lead to it, and I'm seeing data on the data bus on the processor side, but I'm not seeing anything on the side for the real-time clock. And I'm thinking to myself, that's strange. I should be at least seeing whenever it's trying to write data to that. So the next thing that comes to my mind is, well, maybe it's not actually activating this, IC, or maybe the IC's burn out. Unusual, but okay. So I test the chip select pin. And the chip select pin, believe it or not, actually has a clock signal on it. And whenever I say a clock signal, specifically 32 kilohertz. That's strange, because that's, the frequency for the real-time clocks, crystal. I don't know what that's about, but okay, let's see where this goes. So I start, tracing back on this particular signal. And it eventually runs up underneath a IC socket. And when I say an IC socket, it's actually, it runs underneath the IC socket for the keyboard connector, which then has 2 ICs underneath. So now it's underneath and I can't tell where it's going. But I eventually probe around enough and I figure out where it went. Now once I figured out where it went, I start following that trace back along its little route. And it's not broken. It doesn't appear to have any solder bridges anywhere. But then I noticed something. And on the back side of the board, in this area here, the legs for the IC socket appeared to be a little bit longer than normal. They appeared to be, well, I mean, when you do this hobby enough, you can kind of tell how far IC socket legs stick through a PCB. and they just appeared to be longer than normal. I couldn't figure out, what that was about. I just figured, okay, well, that's kind of an unusual socket, but, no problem. Until I got to seeing one leg. And that one leg was so long, and that it apparently was just the perfect candidate to be able to bend over like that. And it was bending over, and it was laying flat on the board. And I got to take a look closely at it with a magnifying glass. It hadn't gone through the solder mask. It was just laying on top of the board, flat. So I said, okay, well, it didn't cut the trace, so that's not a problem. Well, I said, let's try bending that up. So I bent that trace up, and I, wired the or got the memory back on the board, got it plugged up to a power supply, video card, hooked it up to the monitor, and you know what? Sure enough, board booted right up, and it hasn't had a single problem since. There was nothing wrong with the traces on the board. There was nothing wrong from corrosion or anything like that. It was simply the leg of an IC socket had bent over, and the capacitance between that leg and that signal for that transceiver chip was just enough to keep it from being able to turn on that transceiver and speak with the real-time clock. It was literally just the trace was too close to another signal, and once I moved it away, it worked perfectly fine. So that's a long story. But the reason why I shared that with you is I worked on this board for a year and a half, and there was really nothing wrong with this board but for a leg that was bent over. So the moral of the story is this: look for the most simplest solution to a problem. If you need to trace something back and just make sure that it's not touching anything, do that. Something as simple as whenever the factory soldered the legs in, maybe they get just a little bit too much solder between two pads and they're connected when they shouldn't be. You can usually tell, because if it's supposed to be connected, it'll be nice and neat, usually have a line between the two, but if it's a solder bridge, it'll kind of look gloppy and looks like it was kind of a boulder of solder that went over and touched something. Or it may just be simply something as little as maybe a leg on an IC just wasn't completely soldered right. Maybe a cold joint, as we hobbyists like to call it. So check all those things out, because at the end of the day, most of these boards are going to be repairable in one manner or another. It doesn't matter if it's something as complex as having to repair traces, something as simple as bending a leg up, or repairing power traces. I've run on very few boards that weren't at least partially repairable. Now, the exception is 2 out of these 3. 2 out of these 3 are in pretty bad shape. They've got a problem. One of them has a problem with the EEPROM. Another one has so much damage to the board that I'm just not sure that it's going to be repairable. If it is it going to be a stable board to operate? The other one, it's got some problems, but it looks as though it can be repaired. The issue is just simply taking the time to sit down and do it. So that said, I hope you found this video interesting. I hope that you got some ideas for repairing some of your own motherboards that you may have that need repairs. If you don't have any motherboards that need repairs, consider yourself a very fortunate individual, because for us here in the wasteland of Oklahoma, we don't have many of these, and we have to make do with what we have. So we have to make these repairs in order to get them working. So that's all for today, folks. If you have something that you want me to do a video on, be sure and contact me. Check out the website, retrodepot.net. I typically post on there at least once or twice a month. Not a whole lot of new material on there, but I do some commentary on different projects and things that you don't see here as frequently. For example, one of the videos I did last year was of the ZX Spectrum clone that I did, and I'm actually planning on shooting a video about that here pretty quick. Matter of fact, it may be one of the next videos coming up in the not too distant future. But check that out, because I put a lot of information on there. I have lots of downloads. If I find something that's interesting, I typically host it on the site. That way it can be downloaded by anybody who's interested. And then, of course, if you like the video or if you want to support the channel, give me a thumbs up. Hit the subscribe. That really helps out with the metrics and helps me get out to other people that are into this hobby. Feel free to share. And like I said before, if you've got something that you want me to take a look at, be happy to take a look at it. Shoot me an email. Email's on the website. It's got a contact me page. Shoot me an email. Be happy to discuss it with you, see what you got, and see if it's something I'd be willing to take a look at for you. Even if it's something as simple as maybe your own little hobby board that you're doing. I'd love to take a look and see what you guys are up to. So, again, thanks for tuning in this week. We'll be back next week with something else. Again, we are going to, tongue-tied. We are going to be doing something on the ZX Spectrum clone, as well as another board that I've got coming up. It's kind of special. I'm not going to reveal it just yet, but it's kind of in that same little line. So if you're into stuff like that, check in from time to time. I'm always posting videos and stuff like that. But thanks again. We'll see you next week.